When many people hear the name Sun Tzu, they immediately think of wars, generals, words filled with strategy, and even those famous quotes spreading across social media that many people share without ever opening his books. Because of these things, people always see this man in the same way, as if he were a philosopher who dedicated his entire life to explaining the secrets and techniques of winning wars. But here is the interesting part. This version of Sun Tzu that people are introduced to is not the real Sun Tzu at all. Because when you put aside the legends and the romantic image that has been attached to him over the years, you encounter someone completely different. Sun Tzu's true purpose was not to win wars. In fact, it was the exact opposite, to avoid entering wars as much as possible. According to him, success was not about killing more enemies. It was not about building a stronger army. It was never about glory, money, concubines, or a display of power. The place where he focused was completely different: cost. Yes, it may sound a little strange, but the greatest question that existed in Sun Tzu's mind was this: after this war is over, who will pay the price for it? Because in the world where he was born, states were constantly at war with one another. A war did not only consume people, it also consumed the treasuries of nations. Even the victorious side returned with a devastated economy every single time. Sun Tzu was perhaps one of the first people in history to see this reality so clearly. According to his way of thinking, the enemy of the state was not the army standing against it. The real danger was the bill that arrived after the war ended. Even today, a huge number of people still think that The Art of War is a book written about fighting. On the contrary, when the book is properly read, it tells a very different story. This book explains that money, power, and governing a state cannot be separated from one another, and this is exactly why this story is far more connected to finance than you might think. Welcome to a channel where money, power, and history come together, where nothing is actually as ordinary as it appears. If you want to understand why Sun Tzu had such a different way of thinking, you first need to understand the world he lived in. Because most of the ideas he presented were not created in a vacuum. Quite the opposite. They were born in the middle of a collapsing order. During the 6th and 5th centuries BC, China was not a single unified country like we know it today. It was divided into kingdoms that were constantly fighting against one another. Every one of them believed they would be the one to unite all of China. Of course, this ambition came with a price, and that price grew heavier with every passing year. Eventually, war was no longer an exception. It had become a normal part of everyday life. An alliance created today could collapse the next day. A state that was considered an ally could instantly become an enemy. States never truly trusted one another. On top of that, wars themselves were beginning to change. In the past, there had been grand and ceremonial battles fought by a few aristocrats riding chariots. But now things were different. Armies were becoming larger every year, and massive military campaigns involving thousands of soldiers were being organized. And people were failing to notice one extremely important detail. Building a large army did not simply mean recruiting more soldiers. It required more food, more iron, more horses, craftsmen, taxes, and supply lines stretching for kilometers. As wars grew larger, it was not only the risks on the battlefield that increased, the cost grew rapidly as well. When a king sent his armies on a campaign, he was not simply declaring war, he was borrowing from his own future. If a war did not end quickly, the price that had to be paid could sometimes cause even more destruction than what the enemy itself would have caused. This was exactly what Sun Tzu recognized. When people in the modern world think about ancient wars, heroic stories usually come to mind: powerful commanders, incredible battles, and glorious victories. But behind the scenes, this entire process was something much more ordinary. When an army began to move, money began to disappear as well. Chariots had to be transported, horses had to be fed, soldiers had to be supplied, weapons had to be produced, roads had to be protected, blacksmiths had to work, cooks had to prepare food, and porters had to carry supplies. And even a single one of these tasks could create problems before the war had even truly begun. Military campaigns that lasted for only a few months could destroy the economy of a small state. Wars that continued for years could bring even the strongest kingdoms to their knees. Yet no matter what happened, nobody was stopping. Because every state was driven by the exact same fear. If I do not fight, my rival will become stronger. This mindset pushed everyone to recruit more soldiers, impose heavier taxes, and spend even more. It was the earliest version of what we would later call an arms race. Sun Tzu emerged exactly during a period like this. He was not someone who simply sat in silence for hours and wrote abstract theories about war. He was a strategist trying to solve one of the greatest problems of the real world. And he was probably among the first people to understand this truth. The real problem was not our enemies. The real problem was the self-destructive behavior of states themselves. Today, when Sun Tzu is mentioned in the Western world, he is often presented as an ancient philosopher giving advice to successful business executives. But in my opinion, this is one of the worst possible ways to understand him, because Sun Tzu was not a motivational speaker. He was closer to a risk manager. Unlike others, he did not look at war and see heroism. He saw numbers and calculations. He saw costs. He saw time, logistics, and resources being drained away. And when he looked around at the world surrounding him, he reached a very clear conclusion about states. If they continued fighting this way, even the winner would lose. Because a victory achieved after exhausting the treasury did not mean much. Most rulers of that period believed the greatest threat was the enemy army outside their borders. Sun Tzu, however, believed the exact opposite. According to his logic, the thing that would destroy a state was usually not the enemy outside, but the uncontrolled spending of war within. That is why, right at the beginning of The Art of War, he makes a very important statement. War is of vital importance to the state, because according to him, a state usually collapses not because of its enemy, but because of the resources it consumes from within. Therefore, The Art of War is not actually a book written about courage. It is a book about restraint. It is not about aggression. It is about stability. A ruler who can protect his resources is wiser than a ruler who conquers cities. A commander who wins without fighting is more successful than a commander who wins after losing thousands of soldiers. And a state that knows when not to fight is much stronger than a state that only knows how to fight. Perhaps the greatest lesson Sun Tzu left behind can be summarized in a single sentence. Real power is not measured by how hard you can strike, but by how well you can afford the cost of delivering that strike. History has shown this repeatedly. States that were able to protect their economies survived. Those that consumed their resources eventually collapsed, even if they possessed the largest armies, because wars end. But their bills most of the time continue to be paid for by generations afterward. If this video gave you the chance to see Sun Tzu from a completely different perspective, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the best way to understand the future is to look at history from the right perspective. When most people read this sentence, they only focus on the words vital importance. But the message Sun Tzu wanted to deliver was slightly different. Vital also meant something extremely dangerous. When handled poorly, war could become a force that destroyed a state from within instead of protecting it. This is exactly what he continues to explain throughout the rest of the book. Not how to make war more glorious, but how to make it shorter, how to control it more effectively, and most importantly, how to end it with the lowest possible cost. In reality, there is one single idea at the center of the entire book: minimizing financial risk. Even one of his most famous quotes is based on this idea. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. When people hear this, they often think it is some mysterious piece of ancient wisdom. But what is actually being explained here is extremely practical. If you can achieve the result you want without fighting, why drain your treasury? Why lose soldiers? Why place your economy under a burden from which it may not recover for years? Sun Tzu's logic was exactly this. For the same reason, Sun Tzu strongly disliked wars that continued for a long time, because according to him, as a war dragged on, it was not only the soldiers who became exhausted, the state became exhausted as well. The economy slowly bled out, taxes increased, production declined, the treasury was emptied. That is why he constantly emphasized speed, efficiency, accurate intelligence, and psychological superiority, because all of these were much cheaper than building massive armies. In other words, Sun Tzu's goal was not actually to win more wars, it was to prevent states from bankrupting themselves while trying to win wars. And to understand why this way of thinking was so extraordinary, we also need to look at how war was viewed before him. Before Sun Tzu, the understanding of war was quite different. For centuries, among aristocrats, war was also considered a matter of honor. The result was certainly important, but the real issue was showing courage, gaining fame, and proving superiority over one's rivals. Nobody sat down and seriously calculated how much this would cost the state. But times began to change. The population increased, armies grew larger, weapons advanced, and war stopped being the dramatic clashes of ancient times and became a massive economic burden. Now, simply having brave soldiers was not enough to keep a state standing. Tax systems had to be created, coins had to be standardized, large bureaucracies had to be established. Because for armies of this size to survive, an entire economy working behind them was necessary. This was exactly where Sun Tzu separated himself from others. He understood that the old way of thinking about war no longer worked. Now, war was not a display of chivalry, heroism, or honor. It was a massive financial risk threatening the state's resources. Perhaps this was the most important point that separated him from other military thinkers throughout history. While many people glorified war, Sun Tzu examined war almost like an accounting ledger. Long before concepts that we call supply chains, resource management, or opportunity cost today even existed, he had already understood their logic. Because he knew that every decision made on the battlefield would eventually return and affect the state's treasury. A commander who made a mistake would not simply lose soldiers. Sometimes he could bring down an entire state with him. That is why, when you begin reading The Art of War through this perspective, everything changes. The book no longer feels like the poetic advice of an ancient philosopher. It begins to read more like a strategic report calculating the cost of war. At the very beginning of the book, Sun Tzu speaks of 5 fundamental elements that determine the outcome of war. At first glance, these may appear to be highly philosophical concepts: moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method, and discipline. But when you examine them more closely, you realize they all serve one single question: are you truly in a position to afford this war? How stable is the state? How resilient are the people? How organized is your army? How efficiently can you use your resources? Sun Tzu was actually performing a risk analysis from the very first pages of the book, and he clearly states this. If you cannot calculate the cost of war, you cannot calculate the strategy of war either. Therefore, a significant part of the book focuses on logistics rather than heroism. For example, he dedicates an entire section to supplying the army, because according to him, the farther an army moves away from its homeland, the greater the cost becomes. As the distance increases, transportation expenses rise. As transportation expenses rise, the treasury weakens. As the treasury weakens, the state becomes vulnerable, and in the end, before the war is even won, the economy begins to lose. The message Sun Tzu wanted to deliver was actually very simple. It is not enough to win the war only on the battlefield. Your economy must also be able to survive it. Perhaps Sun Tzu's greatest difference was that he never viewed war purely as a military matter. In his eyes, the center of war was not swords or arrows, it was resources. Because of this, he constantly gave the same warning to rulers: use the enemy's resources as much as possible. Do not allow wars to continue longer than necessary. Base your decisions on information. Because all of these were not only effective strategies, they were also forms of good economic management. The importance he gave to intelligence came exactly from this understanding. Today, states spend billions on intelligence operations because accurate information is cheaper than hundreds of wrong decisions. Sun Tzu understood this 2,500 years ago, According to him, the correct information provided by a single spy could save the lives of thousands of soldiers and protect the wealth of a state. The same logic applied to speed as well. When he said, speed is the essence of war, he was not actually telling people to attack without thinking. He was explaining this. The longer a war continues, the more expensive it becomes. With every passing day, more money is spent, more resources are consumed, more production comes to a halt, and eventually, even if you win on the battlefield, you begin losing economically. That is why for Sun Tzu, the most valuable victory was not the victory where you killed the most enemies. It was the victory where you spent the fewest resources, and if possible, it was the victory achieved without fighting at all. That is why he placed so much importance on diplomacy, deception, alliances, and psychological superiority, because these methods were both cheaper and did not weaken the state. And the most interesting thing is this. Even though 2,500 years have passed, what he said still remains valid. Today, countries are not considered powerful only because of their armies. They are judged by their economies, by their debt burdens, by their production capacities, by their supply chains, and by how long they can endure prolonged crises. Technology changed, weapons changed, the nature of war changed, but the cost of war never changed. Perhaps this is the biggest point people misunderstand about Sun Tzu. He was not teaching rulers how to win wars. What he was truly teaching was how not to bankrupt their own states while trying to win wars.